Welcome to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia, the story of the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles and the woman behind the myth who never dreamed of infamy. This is Allegra Lansing. In episode 8, The Body in Leimert Park, LA wakes to horror, and the woman who was once Elizabeth Short becomes the most scandalous name in its history. This episode includes descriptions of violence and details surrounding Elizabeth Short's torture, murder, and the despicable way her killer disposed of her body. You now know the young woman behind the nickname, and once you know someone, even across the distance of decades, the reality of what was done to them lands very differently. Nothing in this series is shared for shock value. Understanding the truth of this crime requires us to confront it honestly. Elizabeth Short deserved a life that unfolded in sunlight. The least we can do now is approach the darkness of her story with care. Discretion is advised. For 7 episodes, we have followed Elizabeth Short in life. We've known her as a daughter, a sister, a friend, a restless traveler, a woman full of longing and invention. We've tracked her through childhood illnesses and family betrayals, through the wandering years that took her from Massachusetts to Florida to California and back again. We've glimpsed her hunger for love, for security, for something larger than what her modest family home could offer. And we've walked with her through her final months, drifting from Long Beach to Hollywood, from Mark Hansen's house to the Chancellor, from San Diego with the French family, and back to Los Angeles with Red Manley. We know the woman. We know what she was chasing and perhaps what she was running from. But all of that, her life, her yearning, her choices, her small deceptions, and her larger dreams, is about to vanish under the weight of something else. With the discovery of her body on January 15, 1947, Elizabeth Short ceased to exist as a private person. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a lost young woman trying to make her way. She became something else entirely. A spectacle, a story, a myth for the ages. The young woman, Elizabeth Short, died that day, but the Black Dahlia was born. From here, our story changes. We leave behind the chronicle of Elizabeth's lived years and enter into the shadow of her eternal life, the life that has endured in headlines, in police files, in books, movies, rumors, and endless speculation. This next chapter begins not with her voice or the voices of those who loved her, but with a stranger's startled cry in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood. It was late morning on January 15, 1947. Betty Bersinger, a 22-year-old housewife, lived nearby in Leimert Park, a still developing residential neighborhood on the west side of Los Angeles. She had her 3-year-old daughter Anne with her that day. Betty was on her way to a shoe repair shop, pushing Anne in a stroller along South Norton Avenue between Coliseum Street and West 39th. The lots there were mostly empty, dusty patches of earth, weeds, and scrub, parcels waiting for developers to build the modest homes that were filling up the neighborhood. It was bright, open, ordinary. And then she saw it. At first, Mrs. Bersinger thought it was a mannequin. In her words, it was so white. It looked like a store dummy, something like a mannequin that had been thrown away. She stepped closer, wheeling the stroller along the sidewalk. Then she realized it was not a mannequin. It was a woman, a body. Later, she recalled, "I thought, my God, that's somebody lying there." She rushed with her daughter to a nearby house to call the police. Betty Bersinger was, in a sense, the first member of the public to meet the Black Dahlia. But unlike reporters or police, she met her first not as a mystery to be solved, not as a symbol, but as something horrifyingly real, something that stopped her in her tracks. She never forgot the image. In later interviews, decades on, Mrs. Bersinger still described the sight in halting, haunted tones. A young woman whose death was staged like a cruel piece of theater for her and for the city to find. It was Betty Bersinger's scream into the telephone, her words to the operator, "There's a body, a woman's body in a vacant lot," that set the machine of history in motion. And with that call, Elizabeth Short's death entered the public record. But there is a reason why Betty Bersinger did not immediately recognize that the bisected and mutilated body of Elizabeth Short was a corpse, because it was not initially where or how police would find it several minutes later. Betty was walking on the sidewalk, stroller in front, when she saw the body in the weeds and then ran to call police. Betty then returned to the scene where she spoke with law enforcement. But what wasn't revealed until this past year, with the publication of the book Sisters in Death, The Black Dahlia, The Prairie Heiress, and Their Hunter by Eli Frankel, who spoke to Betty Bersinger before her passing and learned something that had never been made public before. Upon her return to the scene, Mrs. Bersinger noted that the body was not in the position it had been when she first came upon it. She first saw the body stacked on top of itself, the lower half below, the upper half on top, with the back facing up. That's why it looked like a mannequin. It wasn't just in pieces, but arranged in a stack. The face obscured, and the skin was blanched white, drained of blood. A bloodless body in that position would initially look like a mannequin at a distance. Betty Bersinger could not have been gone more than 20 minutes between leaving the body to call for help and returning to give her statement to police. But in those 20 minutes or less, the body had been moved. The woman's body now lay in two distinct pieces, separated by perhaps a foot and angled, the bottom half closer to the sidewalk and the top closer to the weeds. She was now facing up as well, for onlookers and police and press to see what had been done to her. Her head was battered, eyes partially open in death. Her mouth was slashed open on either side, nearly to each ear, into a grotesque smile. There were marks of torture on the torso and on upper and lower extremities, ligature impressions on wrists, ankles, and neck, cuts and abrasions across the body. 2 pieces of flesh had been excised, much of her right breast and a piece of her lower left thigh. And of course, her body was nude and severed. The body was moved between Mrs. Bersinger's discovery and the arrival of law enforcement. The body was not staged the way police found it, but how Betty Bersinger initially did, not to be found by the first commuters driving by in the morning or the first school kids riding on their bikes to class. It was, in fact, not left to be easily found, but to be later discovered. Mrs. Bersinger did not move the body, nor did police who showed up and found the body staggered there as it was. But someone came upon the body in the weeds after Mrs. Bersinger did, approached it, and touched it. Somebody came upon the scene, saw the body, went to it, dragged the legs closer to the sidewalk, and then lifted up the top half, discovered what it really was, and dropped the top half face up. Who could that have been? It is doubtful the person who dumped the body in the lot would have returned and risked exposure. Likely it was simply someone else who came upon the scene, another neighbor or passerby. They might have heard sirens in the distance and panicked, realizing they should not have touched the body, and fled. Or they could have left long before police began their voyage to the scene. Whoever they were, and whatever their reasons for not remaining behind to give their statement, they also critically may have removed or even left behind evidence. The call from Betty Bersinger came in just after 10:30 a.m. Patrol officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald were dispatched to South Norton Avenue. Within minutes, they were standing in front of the most grotesque crime scene either had ever witnessed. Police arrived first, but in 1947 Los Angeles, reporters listened to the same radio calls. News photographers, led by Herald Express cameraman Perry Fowler, reached Norton Avenue moments later, before detectives had fully secured the scene. The woman's body lay in two sections, about a foot apart and a foot distant. The top half, arms raised over her head. The lower half had been shifted slightly to the side, the legs spread in a way that shocked everyone at the scene. The skin was startlingly pale, drained of blood, and there was almost no sign of the violence that had produced such a state. No puddle of blood, no smears in the dirt, no weapons left behind. It looked more like a staging than a murder scene. But again, if the body had been staged, it was not deliberately put into the position that officers found it in, or that we have seen in the photographs. Fitzgerald later told colleagues he could not shake the sheer emptiness of the lot, how the body seemed to lie there without context, dropped from nowhere. There wasn't a mark of blood in the weeds, he said, not a drop on the ground. It was like someone had placed her there like an exhibit. There was, however, a bit of watery blood on several empty paper cement sacks lying near the body in the vacant lot, the kind commonly used for building materials in post-war Los Angeles. Some reports indicated the bags were beside or partially beneath the body when Betty Bersinger first noticed the figure in the grass, appearing at first glance like discarded debris rather than anything significant. They seemed ordinary, out of place only in their proximity to the dead woman, another quiet detail recorded at the scene before the scale of the crime became clear. The next to arrive were detectives from University Division, including Detective Harry Hansen and Sergeant Finis Brown. They quickly saw that this was no ordinary homicide. Hansen would later describe the scene as one of the most ghastly in his career. It was like something out of a nightmare. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Cutting a body in two like that? That's a surgical job. Both Hansen and Brown were experienced homicide investigators, accustomed to violent crime. But even by Los Angeles standards, the scene before them was extraordinary, not only for its brutality, but for the speed at which crowds and reporters were already gathering. Curious neighbors had come to the scene. People leaned over fences, craning to see what had caused the commotion. One member of the press climbed onto the roof of a nearby vehicle to snap photos from that vantage point. Within the hour, dozens of officers, many without assignments to the case, swarmed the lot. There was no perimeter set, no attempt to keep the growing crowd at bay. Officers stepped through weeds, over footprints, contaminating the ground. Hansen admitted later, We lost a lot that first day. Too many boots in the dirt. More officers from homicide arrived, including Captain Jack Donahoe. Donahoe was blunt and combative, quick to give sound bites to reporters. He took one look and declared it a fiendish act. Others on the scene used words like sadist, sex killer, psychopath. Already, before any autopsy or forensic evidence, the narrative was forming. This was the work of a madman. By noon, the LAPD's crime lab had been summoned, but it was too late. Much of the trace evidence had been trampled, handled, or disregarded. Photographer Arthur Fellig, known as Ouija, once said that crime scenes often tell you more in the first 10 minutes than in the next 10 months. On Norton Avenue, those first 10 minutes were squandered. If the police mishandled the early hours of the investigation, the press wasted no time taking control of the story. The images Perry Fowler captured, officers standing over Elizabeth Short's body in the vacant lot, would soon appear in stark black and white across evening editions. Aggie Underwood, city editor of the Los Angeles Herald-Express, was among the first reporters to reach South Norton Avenue that morning, rushing to the scene ahead of many of her colleagues. In an era when crime reporting was overwhelmingly dominated by men, Underwood had built a formidable reputation through persistence, instinct, and a willingness to go where others hesitated, rising from a difficult childhood to become one of the most powerful newspaper women in Los Angeles. She later recalled the scene as instantly different from anything she'd covered before, not simply a murder, but something almost cinematographic. And she understood almost immediately that the case would consume the city. Yet in later reflections, Underwood also expressed discomfort with how quickly the story became spectacle, acknowledging that while competition drove newspapers to chase every detail, the press risked turning Elizabeth Short into a character rather than a victim. Her early presence at the scene placed her at the center of the unfolding media storm, a reporter both helping shape the narrative and, in hindsight, recognizing the cost of how that narrative was told. The press had unprecedented access. Some reporters walked within feet of the crime scene, observing as detectives worked. Others spoke openly with officers, recording speculation alongside fact. The scene quickly became chaotic, a mixture of investigation and spectacle. One journalist later admitted, "It was like we were all part of the investigation that day. The cops needed us to spread the word, and we needed them for details. It was all wide open." And then came the question every editor wanted answered. Who was she? The LAPD had no identification. There was no purse, no papers, no jewelry at the scene. She was listed initially as Jane Doe No. 1, 1947. But the Los Angeles Examiner moved aggressively to identify her before the competition could. Managing editor James Richardson ordered reporters to get a name immediately. The case, with its shocking presentation and cinematic horror, promised headlines that could dominate the city. By late afternoon, Examiner reporters had contacted the FBI, which maintained fingerprint files from military employment and prior arrests. Elizabeth Short's prints were on file from her 1943 arrest in Santa Barbara. Within hours, the newspaper had her name. In some cases, before confirmation had fully circulated through the LAPD itself. The Examiner went further. Reporters tracked down Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, in Medford, Massachusetts. Phoebe Short's life in Medford was quiet and ordinary. She worked as a bookkeeper for the Holland Butter Company on South Market Street in Boston, commuting daily by trolley. She was not particularly social and preferred evenings at home, often playing piano. A faithful member of the First Baptist Church on Oakland Street, she attended services regularly and lived with her daughters in a third-floor apartment on Salem Street, where the family had resided since 1936. Each daughter had followed her own path. Virginia sang opera and played violin. Dorothy, known as Dottie, had served in the Navy during the war as part of a Japanese code-breaking unit. Noni was known for her writing. Muriel, the youngest, had recently graduated high school and loved animals. By January 1947, only Virginia and Elizabeth lived away from home. When Phoebe returned home the evening of the call and began preparing dinner, a neighbor informed her that a reporter was on the phone downstairs. The caller, Wayne Sutton of the Examiner, asked if she had a daughter named Elizabeth Short. He continued asking questions about Elizabeth's appearance and life. When Phoebe finally asked why, Sutton lied. He said her daughter had won a beauty contest. Jimmy Richardson himself had instructed Sutton to use the deception. The newspaper had traced Elizabeth through her arrest record and employment card at Camp Cook and wanted the story before rival papers could confirm it. The scoop came at the cost of dignity. Eventually, Sutton admitted to Mrs. Short that he had called to verify whether her daughter was indeed Elizabeth Short, who had been found murdered in Los Angeles. Devastated, Phoebe called her daughter Dorothy, who in turn contacted her fiancé, an Army Air Force veteran. He reached out to Medford police, who initially knew nothing about the case. For a brief moment, Phoebe allowed herself to believe the story might be mistaken. That hope ended later that night when official confirmation arrived from California. Soon, reporters gathered outside the family's Salem Street apartment, photographing the home and questioning neighbors. Phoebe's minister rushed over to console her and help make arrangements for travel. Virginia and her husband, Adrian West, would meet her as she journeyed west to claim her daughter. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the press continued shaping the narrative. Columnists began typing articles describing Elizabeth as a beautiful but wayward girl. Headlines implied prostitution, drug use, and moral decline. None of it was substantiated, but sensationalism sold papers. In the rush to publish, rumor overtook fact, and Elizabeth's reputation was rewritten in real time. One reporter later reflected with uncomfortable honesty, "The cops bungled the evidence, and we bungled her reputation." On January 16, 1947, Elizabeth Short's body was brought to the Los Angeles County morgue. The case was assigned to Dr. Frederick Newbar, one of the county's most experienced autopsy surgeons. The report he filed that day remains one of the most detailed and unsettling documents in LAPD history. The condition in which Elizabeth's body had been discovered in Leimert Park had already shocked the public, but inside the coroner's suite, stripped of headlines and speculation, the evidence told its own story. And like so much in this case, every answer seemed to open new and more troubling questions. Dr. Newbar identified the official cause of death as hemorrhage and shock due to concussion of the brain and lacerations of the face. In practical terms, Elizabeth had suffered several severe blows to the head, with one powerful enough to render her unconscious. The cuts, extending from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, had been inflicted while she was still alive, though possibly not fully conscious at the time. Whether these injuries were meant to prolong suffering or to serve as a deliberate and symbolic act of cruelty remains unclear, but their nature suggested intent rather than impulse. One of the most infamous aspects of the case was the bisection of her body. The cut had been made between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, a procedure known in surgery as a hemicorporectomy. It is rarely performed outside of extreme medical necessity and requires precision, separating the body between vertebrae without breaking bone and controlling major vessels to prevent uncontrolled bleeding. Dr. Newbar noted that the cut demonstrated technical skill and confidence. Investigators immediately questioned whether the person responsible possessed surgical training or whether someone with experience in butchery or anatomical study could have achieved the same result. The condition of Elizabeth's body added further complexity. Her body drained of blood, and the body itself had been washed clean and scrubbed with a coconut fiber brush. There was also indication that the body had been wiped down with gasoline, a common technique for removing fingerprints. There was no dirt or debris consistent with the location where she was found. This confirmed that the death and mutilation had occurred elsewhere, most likely indoors, in a place where water, privacy, and time were available. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles suggested she had been bound, possibly to restrain her during the events leading up to her death. Across her thighs and breasts were small burns and cuts, some possibly caused by cigarettes or a heated instrument. These injuries, according to the coroner, were inflicted prior to death. Another deep cut, more than 4 inches long, ran downward from Elizabeth's navel to the area just above her pubic bone, and her right breast had been almost completely cut away. There was also evidence suggesting sexual assault. Dr. Newbar's findings were cautious and inconclusive, indicating injury and dilation, but leaving open the possibility that penetration may have involved an object rather than a person. The ambiguity only fueled speculation, raising questions about whether the injuries were intended as humiliation, ritual, or something more opportunistic and impersonal. Another detail noted during the autopsy was the presence of a greenish material in Elizabeth's stomach. The coroner could not say with certainty what it was. Some believed it may have been fecal matter, suggesting she may have been forced to ingest something degrading while still alive. The report never resolved the question. It was likely the simple act of the severing of the small intestine and the remnants emptying out. But the uncertainty itself leaves a difficult space for the imagination. Another small, unsettling indication that whatever Elizabeth endured in her final hours may have involved not just violence, but humiliation as well. Perhaps the strangest finding involved the rose tattoo Elizabeth had on her left thigh. You remember that story from episode 2, and how Officer Mary Unkefer had noticed it when she allowed Elizabeth to stay with her briefly after her Santa Barbara arrest in 1943. During the autopsy, it was discovered that the tattoo had been cut from her skin. Investigators later reported that the removed piece of flesh had been placed inside her body cavity. Whether this act was personal, symbolic, or intended as some kind of taunt to the coroner remains unknown, but it added to the growing impression that the crime involved not only violence but deliberate messaging. Dr. Newbar estimated that Elizabeth had been dead for approximately 10 hours before her body was discovered. Since Betty Bersinger found her around 10:30 that morning, this placed the time of death late on the night of January 14th or in the very early hours of January 15th. The absence of blood at the scene confirmed what investigators already suspected. Elizabeth had been killed elsewhere, her body transported and placed in Leimert Park with intention. The autopsy reflected the limits of forensic science in 1947. It provided clinical facts but few clear answers. The precision of the injuries suggested knowledge and control, yet revealed little about motive. The washing of the body implied deliberation, not identity. The ligatures and burns pointed toward cruelty, but whether that cruelty was personal or ritualistic remained impossible to determine. And above all lingered the central question: why Elizabeth Short? When Dr. Frederick Newbar submitted his report, it landed on the desk of Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown with a weight heavier than paper. This was not just another homicide file. It confirmed what their instincts had already begun to tell them. Whoever killed Elizabeth Short had skill, access, and an unsettling patience. While the coroner's report gave investigators evidence, it also handed the press a narrative. Each detail, once leaked, became amplified and distorted. The facial wounds became symbols. The missing tattoo became an enigma. Ambiguous findings became lurid headlines. Elizabeth Short quickly became less a person and more a story. Her body turned into a canvas for speculation, invention, and myth. The bisection alone shaped the early direction of the investigation. Detectives began combing through lists of surgeons, medical students, butchers, and morticians, anyone whose work involved anatomical knowledge. Captain Jack Donahoe reportedly told the press, "No layman could have done this. We're looking for someone with anatomy at their fingertips." Internally, however, there was disagreement. Some investigators believed the cut could have been accomplished by someone with determination and a steady hand rather than formal training. Still, the phrase surgical precision took hold, and once it entered public conversation, it carried implications the investigation could not easily escape. The ligature marks and burns suggested confinement. Hansen later said, She was held against her will. This was not a quick killing. This was days." That statement echoed through newspapers, reinforcing the idea that Elizabeth had been tortured for nearly a week before her death. The actual forensic window was narrower, and there was no definitive proof she had been held for the entire period between her disappearance and death. But the physical evidence of restraint made the theory compelling, and it quickly became part of the public understanding of the crime. Another detail that drew attention was the cleanliness of the body. Hansen later noted, "There wasn't a drop of blood left. She'd been drained, she'd been washed. Whoever did this took their time." That time implied privacy, a house or space where such acts could occur without interruption. Detectives canvassed hotels and boarding houses across Los Angeles, asking managers to recall suspicious tenants or unusual activity. In a city defined by transient living and constant turnover, the task was overwhelming. As mentioned earlier, investigators also found several empty construction or cement sacks near the body, ordinary utilitarian items that quickly drew attention for what they suggested about the killer's movements before the body was left in Leimert Park. Trace amounts of watery blood led detectives to speculate that the sacks may have been used as a barrier or liner, laid down inside the trunk of a vehicle so the body could be transported without leaving blood, fluids, or trace evidence behind after it had already been cleaned. One or more of the sacks may also have served as a kind of makeshift gurney, allowing the killer to move the remains from the vehicle to the vacant lot without direct contact, minimizing the risk of leaving fingerprints or transferring new evidence. It was another indication of planning, of someone thinking not only about the act itself, but about what would be left behind afterward. The missing tattoo raised further questions inside the investigation. Why remove something so small and personal? Some detectives initially wondered whether it had been an attempt to obscure identification, but the selective removal of a single rose seemed too deliberate for that explanation, not to mention where it was later found. Others interpreted it as a taunt, a killer signaling that the violence had been personalized, that the act itself carried meaning beyond concealment. One of the earliest questions investigators faced was whether Elizabeth had been killed by someone she knew or by a stranger. The facial mutilations suggested rage, humiliation, or symbolic punishment, something intimate and emotional. Yet the precision of the surgical cut suggested detachment and control. Was this the work of one person capable of both fury and calculation? Or were multiple individuals involved, one driven by sadism, another by technical skill? The autopsy offered no clear answer. Only partial details were officially released to the press, but enough information leaked to ignite public imagination. Headlines flattened forensic nuance into sensational narrative. Sex fiend slays girl, body cut in two, screamed the Herald Express. Mutilation indicates revenge, speculated the Examiner. Each clinical finding became something larger and more dramatic in print. Inside the department, another problem emerged. There were too many leads. Surgeons were interviewed, medical students questioned, mortuaries checked. Rumors flooded in. Sightings of strange men, anonymous confessions, letters mailed to police. The autopsy had provided direction, but it was a direction so broad it threatened to consume the investigation itself. What the autopsy ultimately provided was confirmation that Elizabeth had suffered confinement and prolonged violence, evidence suggesting anatomical knowledge without conclusively identifying its source, and proof that her body had been placed at the scene of discovery rather than abandoned in panic. The mutilation and removal of the tattoo hinted at something personal, though investigators could not determine in what way. Instead of clarifying the case, each discovery opened more possibilities. Was the killer a doctor? A rejected lover? A stranger driven by sadistic fantasy? Was Elizabeth targeted for who she was, or simply because she was vulnerable? Forensic science in 1947 had limits. There were no DNA profiles, no modern chemical detection methods, no reliable way to trace microscopic evidence with certainty. What the LAPD had instead was a body that told a story, but one that could be interpreted in too many ways. And almost immediately, the myth began to outpace the evidence. By the end of that first week, investigators finally had something to work with, and almost nothing at all. A body discovered, tortured, and severed. Evidence suggested planning, restraint, and time. An autopsy that pointed towards skill, patience, and a killer who had not acted in panic. Hansen and Brown now faced the first real task of the investigation: to move backward from what had been done to Elizabeth Short and somehow reconstruct the final days of a life that had begun to disappear into rumor. But even in those earliest hours, something else was happening alongside the investigation. In episode 9, The City of Broken Angels, we continue beyond the compromised crime scene, the autopsy, and the earliest reports. Soon, before the investigation itself had found direction, the press would find something more powerful: a moniker. That name appeared in print almost immediately, dramatic and irresistible, transforming a murdered woman into a headline. At first it was only a label, a convenient shorthand, but it carried weight. It suggested mystery, seduction, danger, a story already being written before the facts were known. It was a name that obscured the real woman found in that empty lot, one that everyone would grab hold of while they let the real Elizabeth fade into oblivion. Investigators were now working two battles at once, one against an unknown killer, and another against a narrative forming beyond their control. The first stage of discovery in the Black Dahlia case was not just about evidence and witnesses. It was about ownership. Who would define Elizabeth Short? The investigators trying to understand what had been done to her, or the newspapers already deciding who she had been? In the days ahead, that question would matter more than anyone yet realized. because the name the press had chosen would begin to eclipse the real victim at the center of the case, the young woman who had suffered, who had died, and whose story was only just beginning to be told. Thank you for listening to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia. Every time we speak her real name, we return a fragment of humanity to a woman the world remembers only for the way she was murdered. This is Allegra Lansing. Until next time, may we remember Elizabeth Short not for how she was found, but for how she lived and how deeply she longed to be seen. This series is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and narration by yours truly. Theme music is Black Screen by Ketsa. Link in show notes.